So today in this video, we're going to look at my very first released track for orchestra, Freyja's Chariot, and we're going to see how I took this small musical idea, this motif, and see how I turned it into this set of phrases for orchestra. Alright, so there are four basic steps that I'm going to be talking about today. The first is how I created the melody, the second is how I harmonized the melody, the third is how I elaborated on the melody, and the fourth is how I orchestrated my ideas. A little disclaimer, this is not an attempt to try to tell you how to compose or arrange in general. This is just a look at the specific process that I used to create this piece. So on to the first step. How I created my melody. And for creating this melody, I was thinking modally. And I have an approach to the modes that I feel like works really well for me. Rather than thinking of the modes as scales that just start on the wrong note, as I actually was taught in middle school, I like to think of them as scales with different harmonic characteristics that are related to each other through common tones. So for instance, I might think of Dorian as a minor scale, but with a raised scale degree 6. So if I'm improvising and going along in minor, and suddenly I want to add some interest, harmonic interest, we'll raise scale degree 6, and suddenly we're in Dorian mode. Similarly, you could be in major, and then lower scale degree 7, and suddenly you're in Mixolydian mode. Right, so I definitely recommend sitting down and thinking about the relationship between the modes. Like this, if you want to write modal music, I find that very helpful. And that's exactly what I did when I was writing this piece. So I actually started with two different phrases, as you can see here, with identical rhythms. One which cadences in Mixolydian mode, and then the second which cadences in Aeolian, and I'll just play those for you. And you can see first one's in Mixolydian, especially because of this F sharp here, in this lowered scale degree 7, this C natural. The second one is in Aeolian because we actually have this F natural there. So yeah, on to the second step, the harmonization. So essentially, I paid a lot of attention to the notes that were being outlined, the sonorities that were being outlined, since they often implied specific chords. Though I did change things up a little bit, you'll notice that I actually started on a D minor sonority, which is not part of Mixolydian since it would have the F sharp instead of the F natural here, which actually kind of changes things around in a fun way. It kind of makes the ear hear that the melody is going through a series of harmonic shifts. So we start off in Aeolian here, and then we have this minor 5, which has a cool modal sound to it as you descend in the melody from the C down to this A. And then once you get to this B natural, you probably interpret that in your ear as being Dorian. And then once you get even lower in the melody to this F sharp, you are firmly rooted in Mixolydian. So it's shifting around. And then the second phrase, which you might expect to do the same thing as the first, the second phrase actually starts off here in an open sound, so it's ambiguous, because especially since we just had this F sharp here, it kind of leaves things open a bit. And then we move to this F natural. Again, like I said, this is Aeolian. and we harmonize that with the B flat, further solidifying that this is in fact Aeolian mode now. We have this flat 6, major flat 6 chord. I think you get the gist of how this is working. We have some sevenths and some add intervals in general, but overall it is pretty simple. It's a very triadic harmonization. So that is essentially how we harmonized it. I can go ahead and play this for you. Alright, moving on to the elaboration. Here we go. So I use a couple of different rhythmic devices to bring my music to life, specifically repeated notes, syncopation, imitation, just to name a few. I added some repeated notes to this accompanying idea right here, and I felt like that really helped to kind of push the piece along. I also added some descending octave leaps to the bass to create some syncopation, right? And that happens because these lower notes naturally have more weight. So instead of just doing, if we're doing something like this, yeah, you're going to feel that a little bit of that syncopation that's going to push things forward. And lastly, I did introduce some imitation as well. So I wanted to repeat this phrase, but if you repeat it verbatim, it can kind of sound a little bit boring. So I actually had the second iteration of our long form melody. We had that moved up an octave for the second time, and then the original line that was playing the melody, that is actually imitating in its original octave. I will just make a little note here that if you're trying to do some imitation, it definitely works best to start on an offbeat. And actually, because our main motif starts on an offbeat, it actually opens up our entire melody and makes it a pretty good candidate for imitation all around. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you, just so you can hear how this is sounding. Alright, moving on to our last step, the orchestration. So I did this, I orchestrated in basically 2 phases. Initially, I simply wrote instrument names into my piano score while thinking about things like the range and the timbre of the instruments. I was also thinking about balance, remembering that brass instruments generally sound a little bit louder, and the section sounds louder than the string section or the wind section. I was also thinking about specific ranges too, right? So, for instance, G2 to G4 is a range that is often kind of the motor for energetic pieces, and that is the range that I was playing this in earlier. Another range to think about is like C1 to C4, which is actually just the whole lower half of your range in the orchestra. A lot of power can come from that in general, but you also want to be careful of your voicings, because if they're too close together, they can cause phasing, they can make a lot of mud, and they can kind of eclipse anything that's directly above them. So yeah, that was something I was thinking about while I was doing this. And of course, the last step was to simply copy and paste this music, my lines, into my orchestral template. So right here I had written horns at 4, strings without the bass sounds bass, contrabass, and the bassoons, etc., etc. So as I was doing that, though, I will note that I was thinking about the way that I was writing rhythms to try to make them as playable as possible on the first reading, just so that my players weren't having an awful time. And that is pretty much it. I'll go ahead and play this for you. the fully scored version one more time, so you can go ahead and listen to that with that new knowledge of the piece that you have. Yeah, my closing thoughts. Of course, there are a couple of things I didn't cover in this video, most of which are just related to the aux instruments, right? So I think of aux instruments as being the icing on the cake. Maybe a harp does a glissando here, or a glockenspiel adds a little color here, or some drums are, doubling the strings, rhythm, or something like that. But if you want to check out any of those details, you can feel free to check those out on the full score version. Actually, a video that I have released previously on this channel under the title Freyja's Chariot. And if you have any specific questions, you can ask on YouTube just by commenting, and I'm pretty good about, I will actually make sure to respond to those. And yeah, if you're interested in some even more advanced orchestration tips or some advice for orchestral programming, consider subscribing so you get notified as I come out with those videos on those topics in the future. So I think that's pretty much all I have for today. Thank you for watching, and go write some music.